Torches hiss like angry snakes in the frozen December air. 300 soldiers stand before the gates of Choctaw Castle, their breath forming clouds in the darkness. The year is 1610, and what they're about to discover will haunt the Western world for centuries, not as history, but as our most enduring nightmare. The massive wooden doors splinter under the force of 30 men. Wood cracks, iron screams, and then nothing. A silence so complete it feels alive, as if the castle itself is holding its breath. The king's representative, a powerful judge named Gheorghe Thurzo, steps through the broken entrance first. He's prepared for a fight, for swords and desperate violence from trapped nobility. What he finds instead is far more disturbing. Everything looks perfectly normal. In the great hall above, candles flicker over a table set with expensive Venetian glass and silver plates. The smell of roasted meat mixes with French perfume. Beautiful tapestries line the walls, showing scenes from ancient myths where gods become monsters and humans become prey. But there's another smell beneath all this luxury. Something metallic, something wrong. The soldiers go down stone steps worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, down into the castle's basement where candlelight doesn't reach, where silk and silver give way to iron and shadow. The temperature drops 20 degrees. The walls drip with moisture that isn't quite water. And then they hear it, a sound that will haunt these men forever. Not quite human anymore, but trying to be. A whimper from behind an iron door, the kind of sound someone makes when they've forgotten how to scream. The door opens. What they find in that cellar challenges everything we think we know about good and evil. Upstairs lives a world of Renaissance education and culture, where a countess who speaks 4 languages and writes to scholars might discuss philosophy over wine. Downstairs exists something that predates language itself, older than castles or kingdoms. Calculated cruelty, applied like a science. How do these 2 worlds exist in the same building? How does a woman who can read Latin poetry in the morning orchestrate torture by night? This is the question that transforms Elizabeth Báthory from a historical figure into the legend that inspired Dracula himself. Because we need her to be one thing or the other. Educated lady or bloodthirsty monster, victim or villain, fact or fiction. We need clear categories, simple explanations. But here, in this moment, when torchlight first reveals what the castle has been hiding, we find something far more disturbing than any simple monster. We find sophistication and savagery living side by side. We find the human capacity to hold beauty and horror in the same hands, sometimes in the same hour. Are we witnessing the unmasking of history's most prolific female serial killer? Or are we watching the birth of a legend, a story powerful men needed to tell about a woman who held too much power? The answer lies somewhere between the dining hall and the dungeon, in that shadowy space where history becomes myth, where a countess becomes a vampire, where what we fear most about unchecked power takes the shape of a woman who wouldn't disappear quietly. Welcome to the thin line between legend and truth. Before we dive deeper into this dark tale, let's place ourselves on the map. This story unfolds across what was then Upper Hungary, now modern-day Slovakia, with tendrils reaching into Transylvania and all the way to the imperial court in Vienna. Picture rolling hills dotted with castles, where local nobles ruled like kings while answering to distant emperors. These borderlands were places where empires collided, where Christian Europe met the Ottoman Empire, where ancient traditions mixed uneasily with new laws. The names in this story carry weight, and pronouncing them correctly helps us understand we're dealing with real people, not fairy tale characters. Elizabeth Báthory, or Báthory, not Bathory as Hollywood likes to say. Her family name means something like brave or valiant in Hungarian, which makes her story even more complex. The castle of Chaktice, pronounced Chaktice, sits on a hill that still overlooks Slovak villages today. You can visit it, touch its stones. Though much of it lies in ruins, György Thurzo, the man who would hunt her, is pronounced György Thurzo. He wasn't some random official, but one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Elizabeth's husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, or Ferenc Nadasdy, was known as the Black Knight of Hungary. And when we mention Vlad Tepes, pronounced Tsepes, we're talking about the real Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, whose legacy of cruelty would later merge with Elizabeth's in our collective nightmares. These weren't distant, exotic figures. They were neighbors, cousins, political allies, and enemies. The Báthory family controlled lands the size of small countries. They were related to kings and princes. When we say Elizabeth was powerful, we mean she could raise armies, mint coins, and pass judgment on thousands of people. This wasn't some isolated madwoman in a tower. This was a CEO of a medieval corporation, if you will, with the power of life and death over her employees. If this kind of deep dive into the real history behind our darkest legends resonates with you, consider subscribing. We're not just here to tell scary stories. We're here to understand how real events become myths, how human beings become monsters in our collective memory, and how the way we tell these stories shapes what we believe about power, gender, and justice. Think about it. When we mispronounce these names, when we treat them like fantasy characters, we're already fictionalizing the story. We're already choosing legend over history. But when we say Báthory correctly, when we place Chaktice on a real map you could drive to tomorrow, suddenly the comfortable distance between us and this tale shrinks. These weren't characters. They were people. And that makes everything that follows far more disturbing. How does saying a name correctly change what we think we know? It reminds us that the real monsters have always looked just like us. Elizabeth Báthory was born into a cage made of gold. In 1560, being born a Báthory meant you were practically royalty. Her family controlled more land than some European kingdoms. They had their own armies, their own laws, their own justice. Her uncle was the King of Poland. Her cousins were princes. From the moment she drew her first breath, Elizabeth was destined for power. But power, especially for women in the 16th century, came with chains. As a child, Elizabeth was brilliant, terrifyingly brilliant. While most noble boys could barely write their names, she was mastering Latin, Greek, German, and Hungarian. She read philosophy and theology. She could debate with scholars. But this intelligence came with a price. She was too smart for the world she was born into, too sharp for the dull routines of noble feminine life. Imagine being able to think in 4 languages, but only being allowed to speak about embroidery and household management. Her childhood was lonely. She wasn't raised by loving parents who tucked her in at night. She was raised by tutors and servants who bowed when they entered her room. She learned to command before she learned to play. She learned that people were tools before she learned they were human. The castle walls that protected her from the dangerous world outside also protected her from understanding that world. She could see the villages from her window, but she might as well have been looking at another planet. At age 11, she was engaged to Ferenc Nadasti. At 15, she married him. This wasn't about love. This was a business merger between two powerful corporations. Ferenc was called the Black Knight of Hungary because of his brutal effectiveness in battle against the Turks. He was a war hero who spent most of his time away from home, leaving his teenage bride to manage vast estates. Imagine being 15 years old and suddenly responsible for thousands of lives. For collecting taxes, managing crops, and dispensing justice. Now imagine doing it completely alone. Elizabeth handled it brilliantly. She was an excellent manager, keeping detailed accounts, making sure the estates prospered. But efficiency isn't the same as empathy. When you're raised to see people as subjects rather than humans, when your whole life is about maintaining control, every small act of disobedience feels like a threat to your very existence. A servant who drops a plate isn't just clumsy, she's challenging your authority. A maid who looks you in the eye isn't just forgetting her place, she's questioning your power. The loneliness grew worse as years passed. Ferenc would return from war for a few weeks, then disappear again. He'd send letters that smelled of gunpowder and blood, telling her about his victories, about the creative ways he'd found to kill enemies. These weren't love letters, they were reports from a slaughterhouse. And Elizabeth, alone in her castle, began to see cruelty as strength, violence as control. Then came the mirror. Every powerful woman in that era had a mirror, but for Elizabeth, it became something more. It became her enemy. She was in her 30s when she first noticed the lines around her eyes. For most of us, aging is annoying. For Elizabeth, it was catastrophic. In her world, a woman's beauty was part of her power. Aging meant weakness. It meant losing control. And control was the only thing keeping her sane in that lonely castle. She started with small cruelties. A servant girl would make a mistake and receive a slap. Then the slap became a beating. Then the beating became something worse. What's terrifying is how gradual it was. She didn't wake up one day and decide to become a monster. She took one small step over the line, then another, then another. Each time it got easier. Each time the line moved a little further. But she wasn't doing this alone. Like any powerful person descending into darkness, she gathered enablers around her. There was Dorka, an old woman who whispered about ancient remedies and blood magic. There was Ilona Jo, her children's nurse, who loved Elizabeth with the blind devotion of a mother. There was Fitzko, a brutal man who would do anything for his mistress. These weren't innocent people corrupted by an evil countess. They were willing participants who saw opportunity in her darkness. Together, they created a system. When Elizabeth flew into a rage, they were there to hold the victim down. When she wanted to experiment with new forms of discipline, they offered suggestions. When she needed to dispose of evidence, they knew where to dig. They turned spontaneous cruelty into organized ritual. What started as anger became method. What started as punishment became pleasure. The most chilling part is how normal it all seemed to them. In their minds, they weren't committing crimes. They were maintaining order. They were teaching lessons. They were protecting the natural hierarchy where nobles ruled and peasants obeyed. Every society has these hierarchies, these systems that say some lives matter more than others. Elizabeth just took that logic to its ultimate, horrifying conclusion. But here's the question that should haunt us. Was this descent inevitable? Was Elizabeth always destined to become a monster? Or was there a moment when everything could have gone differently? What if Ferenc had stayed home more? What if she'd had children who survived to adulthood? What if just one person had shown her genuine friendship instead of fearful obedience? We want to believe there was a turning point, a single moment when she chose evil. It would be comforting to think that monsters are born in an instant, that there's a clear line between us and them. But the truth is messier. Elizabeth Báthory became what she was through 1,000 small choices, 1,000 moments when cruelty was easier than kindness, when control mattered more than compassion. She was brilliant, powerful, and completely alone. She had every privilege except the ones that mattered: love, friendship, and the ability to see other people as fully human. In her gilded cage, surrounded by silk and stone, she forgot that power without empathy isn't strength. It's just another kind of weakness. And by the time she realized the cage she'd built for others had become her own prison, it was far too late to find the key. The whispers started in the villages. A girl here, a girl there. At first, nobody important noticed. Peasant daughters disappeared all the time in 16th century Hungary. They died in childbirth, from disease, from accidents. They ran away to cities or married boys from distant towns. But this was different. These girls weren't dying or running away. They were being collected. The pattern was always the same. A well-dressed woman would arrive in a poor village, promising good work at the countess's castle. She spoke of warm rooms, regular meals, and wages that could support an entire family. For desperate parents watching their children starve, it sounded like salvation. They sent their daughters off with prayers and hope. The daughters never came back. For years, this harvest of the poor continued. Elizabeth had discovered that peasant girls were perfect victims. They were invisible to the law. Their parents couldn't read or write complaints. They had no powerful relatives to ask uncomfortable questions. But like all predators, Elizabeth eventually got greedy. Or maybe desperate is the better word. The peasant girls weren't working anymore. Whatever she was trying to achieve, whatever magic she thought their blood contained, it wasn't enough. So she aimed higher. She announced she was opening a finishing school for minor noble girls. Come learn etiquette from a real countess. Come prepare for marriage into the highest circles of society. The bait was irresistible for families with good names but empty pockets. They sent their daughters to Chaktichi Castle, expecting them to return as refined ladies. Instead, they vanished into the same silence that had swallowed the peasant girls. But noble families were different. They could write letters. They had connections. When their daughters stopped responding, they didn't just worry. They investigated. They compared notes. They realized their daughters had all supposedly fallen ill at the same time, or were all on the same mysterious religious retreat. The coincidences were too many. The excuses were too similar. And unlike peasant families, they had someone to complain to. Enter György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary. Think of him as the kingdom's prime minister and supreme judge rolled into one. He was one of the few people in Hungary whose power matched Elizabeth's. He was also her cousin, which made everything more complicated. When the king ordered him to investigate the countess, Thurzo knew he was walking into a minefield. How do you investigate someone who owns entire counties? How do you arrest someone whose family includes kings? Thurzo was smart. He didn't charge in with accusations. He sent his men out quietly, dressed as merchants and travelers. They visited villages around Chocticus, promising protection to anyone brave enough to talk. Slowly, after years of terrified silence, the stories began to pour out. Parents spoke of daughters who'd left with such hope. Survivors showed scars and told of horrors that seemed impossible. Local priests whispered about midnight burials in unconsecrated ground. The evidence was overwhelming. Thurzo had testimonies from over 300 witnesses. He had names, dates, and detailed accounts of torture that would make seasoned soldiers sick. But he also had a problem. Put Elizabeth Báthory on public trial, and you'd create a scandal that could topple the government. The noble families of Hungary were all interconnected. If one could be a monster, what did that say about the rest? If noble blood could produce such evil, how could they claim to be naturally superior to peasants? On December 30th, 1610, Thurzo made his move. He arrived at Choctic's castle with 300 soldiers, enough to fight a small war. But there was no battle. The castle guards didn't resist. They knew what had been happening inside those walls. They were probably relieved someone had finally come. What Thurzo found inside confirmed every horrible rumor. In the dungeons, he discovered girls in various stages of dying. Some were chained, some were caged. Some were simply too weak to move. The smell of death was everywhere. His men found torture devices that looked more like a blacksmith's nightmare than anything that should exist in a noble home. They found bodies waiting for burial. They found Elizabeth's accomplices trying to destroy evidence. But when Thurzo climbed the stairs to confront Elizabeth herself, he found something that shook even him. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't denying anything. She sat in her dining hall like a queen on her throne, furious not at being caught, but at being interrupted. In her mind, these men had no right to be in her home. The girls in her dungeon were her property. What she did with her property was her business. This is where Thurzo faced an impossible choice. Justice demanded a public trial and execution. The families of the victims deserved to see Elizabeth punished. But politics demanded something quieter. A public trial would require evidence to be presented, stories to be told, details to be recorded. The Báthory name would be dragged through mud, and with it, the entire Hungarian nobility. So Thurzo chose a middle path that satisfied no one completely but kept the kingdom stable. Elizabeth's accomplices would face public trial and execution. They were commoners, after all. Their deaths would show that justice had been done. But Elizabeth herself would simply disappear. No trial, no execution, no chance to speak or defend herself. She would be walled up in her own castle, erased from the world while still breathing. The accomplices were tried in January 1611. They confessed to everything, each trying to blame the others while painting Elizabeth as the true monster. Dorka and Ilona Joe had their fingers torn off with hot pincers before being burned alive. Fichko was beheaded. A fourth accomplice was sentenced to life imprisonment. The crowd got its blood. The law got its convictions. But everyone knew the real criminal was sitting in her castle, untouched by justice. Elizabeth was bricked into a small set of rooms in her castle. Not a dungeon, because she was still a countess. Not freedom, because she was still a killer. Just 4 walls, a tiny slot for food, and endless darkness. No mirrors to show her aging face. No servants to command. No victims to torture. Just silence and time. Was this mercy or cruelty? Was it justice or politics? Thurzo had threaded an impossible needle, keeping the kingdom stable while stopping a monster. But in doing so, he'd also shown that in Hungary, as in most places, there were different kinds of justice for different kinds of people. The poor girls who died in Elizabeth's dungeons got no trial. Their killers, when they were commoners, got public execution. But Elizabeth, protected by her noble blood, even in her crimes, got privacy. She lived for 4 more years in that darkness, dying in 1614. No one knows what she thought about in those final years. Did she feel remorse? Did she go mad? Did she spend her time planning the torture she'd inflict on Thurzo if she ever got free? We'll never know. She took her thoughts to the grave, just as Thurzo intended. In the end, the hunter caught the dragon, but instead of slaying it in glorious battle, he locked it in a cave and let time do the killing. It wasn't the ending anyone wanted. It wasn't clean or satisfying or particularly just, but it was the ending that kept the kingdom from tearing itself apart. Sometimes, in the real world, that's what justice looks like. Messy, political, and incomplete. A compromise between what's right and what's possible. A reminder that even when we catch our monsters, we don't always know what to do with them. Every horror story has its thresholds, those moments when you cross from one world into another. In Elizabeth Báthory's tale, these crossings are everywhere, marked by the groan of ancient hinges and the turn of iron keys. The castle itself was a series of thresholds, each one taking you deeper into darkness. Start with the main gate. For the village girls who walked through it, this was the border between everything they knew and a world they couldn't imagine. They crossed from poverty to promise, from sunlight to shadow. The gate that groaned open to welcome them would never open again to let them leave. That sound, metal on stone, was the last free sound many of them would ever hear. Inside the castle, every door was a choice, every stairway a descent. The grand staircases that swept upward to Elizabeth's luxurious chambers were made of the same stone as the narrow spirals that corkscrewed down to the dungeons. Same castle, same stone, but moving in opposite directions. Up led to silk sheets and French wine. Down led to iron chains and darkness. The servants who worked in the castle learned to read these thresholds like a map of danger. Which doors you were allowed to open determined whether you lived or died. The most terrible threshold was the one between the warm, bustling kitchen and the cold chambers below. This was where normal castle life ended and the nightmare began. In the kitchen, bread baked and soup bubbled. 1 floor down, girls screamed. The cooking fires that warmed the great hall also heated the iron instruments in the torture chambers. Same fire, different purpose. The boundary between comfort and cruelty was just a few stone steps. Winter added its own thresholds. In Elizabeth's most infamous torture, she would have girls dragged into the courtyard on the coldest nights. The door from the castle to the courtyard was the crossing from life to death, from warm blood to ice. She would have water poured over their naked bodies until they froze solid, becoming statues in her garden of cruelty. The threshold between liquid and solid, between girl and ice sculpture, between human and object. The snow itself was an omen. In Hungarian folklore, snow covers sins, hides bodies, erases evidence, but it also preserves. Those frozen girls were suspended between life and death, their last expressions captured perfectly in ice. Elizabeth would walk among them like a queen surveying her subjects. These girls who would never age, never disobey, never disappoint her again. Fire played the opposite role. Where snow preserved, fire consumed. The candles that lit Elizabeth's mirror also dripped wax onto flesh. The flames that warmed her chambers also heated the pincers and pokers. Fire was transformation, turning solid to liquid, flesh to ash, evidence to smoke. The same element that represented civilization and warmth became an instrument of savagery. But the most important threshold was the mirror itself. Every time Elizabeth looked into it, she crossed from the external world to the internal, from what others saw to what she feared. The mirror was a doorway that only opened one way. You could look in, but you couldn't change what you saw. For someone obsessed with control, this was the ultimate tyranny. The mirror showed truth, and truth was the one thing Elizabeth couldn't torture into submission. The mirror created its own omens. A new line around her eyes wasn't just a sign of aging. It was a prophecy of powerlessness. A gray hair wasn't just a hair. It was a herald of death. Every morning, the mirror showed her a future she couldn't accept, a threshold she couldn't avoid crossing. And in trying to fight that crossing, she created so many others. Think about the psychological thresholds in this story. The first time Elizabeth struck a servant in anger. The first time she drew blood. The first time she enjoyed it. Each action was a door that once opened couldn't be closed. Each cruelty made the next one easier. The threshold between discipline and torture, between punishment and pleasure, between human and monster. These were crossed so gradually that perhaps Elizabeth never noticed when she stepped over them. Her accomplices crossed their own thresholds. Dorka, when she first suggested using blood for beauty. Ilona Yo, when she first held down a struggling girl. Fichko, when he first disposed of a body. Each of them had a moment when they could have said no, could have stepped back. But thresholds are easier to cross than to uncross. Once you've walked through certain doors, the way back disappears. The castle's architecture reflected this. Rooms led to rooms led to rooms, each more private, more hidden than the last. The public chambers where Elizabeth entertained guests were separated from her private torture chambers by dozens of thresholds. Each door, each turn, each descent was a step away from the normal world. By the time you reached the deepest dungeons, you were so far from daylight, so removed from normal life, that anything seemed possible. Even the trial was about thresholds. Thurzo crossing from investigator to judge. The accomplices crossing from loyal servants to confessing criminals. Elizabeth crossing from countess to prisoner. And finally, that last threshold, when the masons sealed her into her rooms. The doorway became a wall. The threshold disappeared entirely. In the end, every threshold in this story leads to the same place: isolation. Elizabeth crossed from connected to alone, from powerful to powerless, from visible to erased. She who had controlled every door in her castle ended up behind a wall with no door at all. The woman who had turned girls into ice statues became a statue herself, frozen not by water, but by stone and mortar. Which thresholds can we never return from? The ones we build ourselves, the ones we cross in our minds before we cross them in the world. The moment we see another person as less than human, the moment we choose cruelty over mercy, the moment we decide that our pain matters more than someone else's life. These are the doors, at once opened, reshape us. These are the crossings that lead step by inevitable step, from dining hall to dungeon, from mirror to monster, from countess to cautionary tale.